Well, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Heather McCargo. Heather McCargo is founder and former executive director of the Wild Seed Project, a 501c3 nonprofit based in Maine and founded in 2014. An educator with 40 years of expertise in native plant propagation, conservation, and ecological design, she started her propagating as a volunteer with Jack Alexander at the Arnold Arboretum in the early 1980s. In the 1990s, Heather was the head propagator at the Native Plant Trust's Garden in the Woods. She has worked in landscape architecture and planning firms, contributed to research projects including the USAID, National Gardening Association, and the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners. As an author, she is widely published in journals and magazines. She has written extensively for the Wild Seed Project's print and online publications and authored a manual on Maine native plants for roadside restoration for the Maine Department of Transportation. Heather was featured in a New York Times article on native seed sowing in 2021. And in October of 2022, Heather was the recipient of the Native Plant Trust 2022 Regional Impact Award. Congratulations, Heather, from all of us. Heather has a BA in plant ecology from Hampshire College and an MA from the Conway School of Landscape Design. It's a true pleasure to have you with us tonight, Heather. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I'm thrilled to be here. The last time I was here was in the mid-1990s when I was in my 30s and worked at Garden in the Woods. And now that I know this is all on Zoom, I guess I should consider rejoining and participating more often because it's really, I care deeply about the flora of New England, and it's great to be with like-minded people. Well, great. Well, I founded Wild Seed Project to raise the awareness about the beauty and importance of native plants, particularly in Maine and northern New England, which is more rural, and hence a lot of nature is taken for granted. And central to our work is demystifying native seed sowing. I've grown hundreds or probably thousands of different native species from seed, from the easy to difficult. And this is not rocket science. And I knew that a lot of people could be doing this. So I had this idea to create a grassroots organization that would inspire people and teach them how to sow the native seeds, both amateur and professional alike. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to walk you through some typical of the seed ripening and how you sow different types of native seeds. And then I'm going to show you some simple outdoor propagation setup that anybody can do to easily produce a lot of plants. But before I go there, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got to, what created this interest in me. Because I had a very feral childhood in southwestern Pennsylvania in the great eastern deciduous forest region that was south of where the glaciers went. And that is where my first love of, ecosystem happened. And it led me to Hampshire College, where there were a lot of dynamic environmental science professors. And my mentor, Ray Coppinger, was an outstanding field ecologist and had these really amazing, outdoor classes looking at different habitats and geology in the landscape. And he was actually a wildlife biologist, and his specialty was in canines, so both wolves and then the domesticated. He particularly did a lot of work with the sheep guarding dogs and herding dogs, and then the feral village dogs from around the world. And he spent a lot of time instilling in his students the effects of inbreeding depression on small isolated populations, which was really happening with the wolf, the few remaining wolf populations in the lower 48 states and the Florida panther. There was a lot of arguments going on in the wildlife biology world about whether they should introduce genes in from outside because of inbreeding depression. And then because he also worked on domesticated dogs, I got a lot of strong messaging about, what's wrong with human selection of plants and all the inbreeding and weakness that can create, particularly in the world of domesticated dogs. So this was really my beginning of an lifelong interest in the wild versus the domesticated. Now, Ray also spent a lot of time teaching about how landscapes change over time, both, the, present how succession happens in nature. And then we looked a lot at the ice ages and past climates and how they really affected, how plants moved about in different times. At the time, we were just first hearing about the greenhouse effect, but we were also, there was a little bit of a dun, 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 we're expecting the next ice age. So it was this very, confusing time about what was going to happen with the climate next. And, the topic of invasive species was barely on the radar at that point. Now, Ray Coppinger had gotten John Torrey, who was the executive director of the Harvard Forest at the time, to come do some research at Hampshire's Farm Center on alder trees, and he needed a greenhouse assistant. And so he, signed me up to be John Torrey's greenhouse assistant. And it was with the time I spent with him, he kept saying, Heather, you're about to graduate. Why don't you go work with Jack Alexander? Go tell him you'll volunteer with him and get, a couple days a week and get a chance to pick his brain. So he was the propagator at the Arnold Arboretum. I think he retired maybe 5 years ago. And that really began my deep dive in woody plant propagation. And one thing that he said that first day I was there, he was showing me around and showing all the different techniques they use to get the seeds to germinate, sometimes filing the coat or lighting a match under the seed or freezing and thawing it, or, doing a warm, moist treatment and a cold treatment. And then he said, but what really works the best is when you just put the seeds outside. These are all temperate plants, and when they're outside, they all will eventually germinate. So that always stuck in my mind. So it was these things that, built the foundation. I then, in the 1990s, worked at Garden in the Woods as the propagator, but it was all this other stuff leading up to it that really set me on my life's work of an interest in native plants and seeds and wild things, and playing with what humans do with those plants. And I have, in my adult life, I have witnessed so many what were once common native species not be common anymore. And as a seed propagator, I kept hearing at so many conferences how are we going to get nurseries growing these plants? How are we going to make this happen? And I just felt like this is easy. A lot of people could be doing this. So that's what led up to it. Now I'm going to walk you through some of the typical ways that our native seeds ripen and disperse, and then how you sow them. I'm going to start with a couple woodland species, because these are the ones, these slow growing woodland wildflowers that give native, the reputation for native plants to be difficult to propagate. This is bloodroot. And, this is one of our first wildflowers to bloom in the spring and pollinated by little teeny bees and sometimes fungal gnats. And after the flowers go by, green seed pod starts to form. It's kayak shaped. By the time it's mature, it's usually about 2 inches long. And about 7 weeks after it finishes blooming, the pod splits and out fall all these little brown shiny seeds, and they all have a little white elaiosome that the ants are after. The ants take the seeds, carry them off, and the ants find them right when they split. So you have to be there on the day that they ripen. Carry them off, they eat the elaiosome, bury the seed in the soil, and these seeds typically germinate not the next spring, but the following spring. So that's very typical of some of these slow growing woodland plants. Another couple ones that are slow to germinate and grow are the trout lily and the white wood anemone. So those both also bloom in usually early May where I live in southern Maine. And the white wood anemone, those seeds usually ripen first, and it's a cluster of little green seeds, and they don't change color, they just stay green. But when they ripen, you just brush your hand against them and they all fall off. You need to collect them and sow them right away, and they also will germinate the second spring. And then the trout lily, that's even trickier to get the seeds, because by the time the seeds are ripened, the whole plant has disappeared. You know, it's a true spring ephemeral, and the seed pod is about half an inch long, and it's just lying prostrate on the ground, and it's tan, looks like the leaf litter, and it pops open, and the seed, you know, all these seeds are dispersed by ants. So if you're not there right when they ripen, you miss them. The trout lily takes about 12 years from seed before it will start flowering. So, you know, these are some of the slower. The bloodroot of all of these is probably the quickest. They are propagatable, you know. I've grown a lot of these from seeds, but these are never going to be mass-produced plants. It takes somebody conscientious who's outside a lot to catch the seeds. Trillium, so, you know, this is a beloved of wildflower gardeners, a beloved plant, and it takes a lot longer for that pod to ripe. So, you know, they're blooming in early May, and it's usually late July, even early August before that pod ripens. So, you know, by then the plant's looking pretty withered, and it's usually about an inch across, different species, different colored fruit there. But when the seeds are ripe, it just literally turns to mush and falls off the plant. And you can see in this picture on the right, the little elaeosome, that's that fleshy protrusion that the ants are after when they're dispersing the seed. That's high in proteins and fats. And so they carry that off to eat that, and then they discard the seed in the ant equivalent of a compost pile. These seeds, you know, so that's that's late July, early August. These seeds will germinate in the second spring, and they usually pretty early in the spring, early April, and the seedling will be about an inch long and less than a quarter inch wide, so just a little wisp of a plant. In the third year, you'll have 3 little leaves, but just a little seedling that's only a couple inches tall. And it's usually in the 6th, 7th, or even 8th year when these start blooming. So these slow-growing woodland wildflowers, they take a lot of patience. They're not hard, but you just got to know how to find the seeds. You got to be there when they ripen and then sow them right away. So these are not the plants that are going to be able to be widely produced. Will always take people more in the know. Then there's some other ant-dispersed woodland plants like the violets, that those seeds, they tend to ripen also about 6 to 8 weeks after the flowers go by. And if you see in that picture, one of the ones that's not open, the flowers kind of hooked like this. And when it's blooming, and then the seed pod is like that. And then the day before it ripens, it points up and then it splits open. And it'll be kind of a tannish color, and there'll be little brown seeds inside. Sometimes they get flung off. They are ant dispersed, so the ants also get these. So if you're not there on the day they split, you'll miss getting them. They're not hard to collect. You can store those seeds dry. So what I like to do is just put them in a paper bag, and then I sow them outdoors later in the fall. The other fun thing about violets is that they have the second way that they produce seeds, and you can see them on the right there. So I don't know if in their evolutionary history that they had because they're a spring bloomer, that in a rainy spring the pollinators wouldn't get to pollinate them, and so they have this second thing where they have flowers that never open up. They burrow underground the way a peanut does, and then when the seed, and so they're not the product of sexual reproduction. It's just the the violet is just producing its own seeds. I believe they're even clones of each other. But those pods will then, when they're ripened, they come up above ground. It's usually September, and then they pot and split. They look exactly the same as the seeds that are a result of sexual reproduction. But these aren't hard. It's just being able to get there and get the seeds, but then you can easily store them dry till you're ready to sow them. So it's hard to collect a lot of seeds of these. Now I'm going to move into some of the less challenging types. There's quite a few spring species. This is marsh marigold, but the anemones, angelica, thalicrums, they all have seeds that stay green when they're ripe. They don't turn tan or brown or black. And the marsh marigold here, you can see after the flower goes by, you'll get this starry cluster. And then when they're ripe, they split along the seam, and you can see those little green seeds inside, and you need to collect those and sow them right away. Now, where the perfect environment to germinate in the wild is damp mud. They're a wetland plant, so often by the time the seed's ripe, the water level has receded a little. There's some damp mud in the shade, and those seeds will fall down, and they'll germinate within a couple weeks to a month, and you will have quite nice sized plants by the end of the summer. When I sow them, I sow them on the surface of the soil, and I put the pot in a dish of water and I put it in the shade. It won't germinate if you put them out in the sun. But not slow growing, just knowing what to look for. Then we've got a lot of species that have seeds that spring out from the plant, and this is the wild geranium. And when these seeds ripen, they turn from being green with it, on any given day, they will within a couple hours turn from green to being black and spring off from the plant. So I go around to our plants and collect them several times a day. Literally it happens that quickly. And if you get them when they're green, they sometimes won't ripen properly. So you really have to check them regularly. But when they ripen, they turn black within a couple hours and just spring off from the plant. And in a little bit, I'll show you what the seedlings of these look like. These seeds can be stored dry, so I also collect them in a paper bag. It takes about 3 weeks to collect a big population, the seeds on it, and then sow them outdoors in the fall in the way I'm going to show you in a minute. Bluets. This is one of my favorite little plants, and we tend to sow most of the seeds we collect, but every year we always offer a few of them up for sale. And this is a tiny little wildflower, and after the flower goes by, so these are usually blooming May and early June, but it's really July before the seeds have ripened, and the plants have nearly disappeared by the time the seed ripens. And so the little stalk with the little teeny pod is maybe a quarter of an inch long and a couple inches tall. But if you don't really know where these plants are, they are really hard to find. You have to get out there with scissors and snip them off. I like to put them in a white paper envelope because they're so teeny. And you can get quite a few seeds on them. So a lot of people have this plant in their lawn and they're good about leaving it while it's blooming, but then they end up mowing it before it's really had a chance for a lot of the seeds to ripen. So really letting the seeds mature. A lot of people just don't realize how long our native plants can take for the seeds to ripen. Jack in the Pulpit. This is probably one of my favorite wildflowers. And it's the northernmost species in a mostly tropical family. And so it comes up really late in the spring, really once the weather has gotten warm. And then it's a dioecious plant, meaning it's either male or female, but it's also unusual in that it can switch back and forth and be male one year and female the next. I think this is a real plant for our modern age of, liking to bend sexual stereotypes. So this one, you'd have to cut it open to see whether it was a male or female flower, but you can just wait and see if the fruits form. And the fruits tend to ripen in late August, sometimes early September, and it's a big cluster. They're emerald green, and then they turn bright red, and then you just collect the seeds, squeeze the seeds out, and plant those. You can store those seeds dry too. And I'm also going to show you what seedlings of this look like in a minute. Then we've got a lot of species that have these tiny dust-like seeds. So the lobelias are classic one of that. And I love this picture because this is like the perfect cardinal flower habitat where it's on a stream side and you can see the damp mud on the far side of the picture. That's where when these seeds ripen, they will disperse and land and germinate. Damp mud in the shade. So, you know, these tend to bloom in Maine in late July, sometimes early August. And then it's usually September when the seeds start ripening because they, you know, bloom from the bottom up. You have to spend, you have to go back regularly to just get the ripened ones, and they turn, the little pod turns tan, and there's tiny little dust-like seeds. So those seeds in windy weather, like, you know, we have a lot these days, those seeds can disperse really far. Those seeds do need a cold period to germinate, and they also need to be sown on the surface of the soil, but kept in the shade until they germinate. Then we've got a lot of our, you know, shrub dogwoods and viburnums and hawthorns and cherries and plums. They all have, you know, these beautiful flowers in the spring, early summer that are great for pollinators. And then these fleshy fruits that, and the seeds have to be kept moist. So what you do is, so that's nannyberry on the left, Highbush cranberry in the middle, and silky dogwood on the right. You collect the fruits when they've ripened, and you need to separate the flesh from the fruit, otherwise it inhibits the germination. Now, a lot of these species have an immature embryo. The seed embryo is a little bit immature when it's ripened, even though the fruit is ripened. And so they need another month or two to mature, and then a cold period before they will germinate. I would expect if you're down in North Carolina or Georgia, where a lot of these species also grow, but when they ripen, there's still a warm fall that they get that time, the embryo gets that time to finish maturing, and then the seeds will germinate the next spring. For us this far north, they typically have a double dormancy, because by the time the fruits have ripened, the weather's gotten too cold that embryo doesn't finish maturing. Sometimes I have luck, you know, how I clean these fruits is I collect them, I put them in a Ziploc bag and start smushing them and let them ferment for a week or so, and then rinse the seeds off, and then I mix them with moist sand, keep them in that Ziploc bag on my desk for another month, and then I sow them outside. And sometimes that extra month just at room temperature on my desk is enough that they will germinate the next spring. But more typically, a lot of these species have a double dormancy. Not all of them. The wild cherries and plum, they'll germinate the next spring. Silky dogwood is particularly fast. That will germinate the next spring. But a lot of the viburnums, like hobblebush, probably everybody's favorite native viburnum, that typically doesn't germinate till the second spring. So if you let the seed dry out, it will not germinate. Then all of our different nuts. So this is American hazelnut, but acorns, hickory nuts, all the walnuts, butternuts, they all have seeds that can't dry out. And I get this a lot where people tell me, oh, I collected all these acorns and I'm so excited to sow them. And I'm like, where have your acorns been? They've been sitting on my kitchen table for 2 weeks. And I'm like, you know, that will kill them. They really need that, you know, they are hydrophilic, they are moisture needing seeds. So you have to, you know, these nuts especially, you have to get there ahead of the squirrels and chipmunks, and you can remove the husk, and then you cannot sow them until you have created the most perfect rodent-proof cage, because, you know, squirrel, chipmunk, mice, it's got to be heavy-duty wire. So if you're not prepared when you're collecting them in the fall, you can just take those seeds. I like to put them in a cup of water or a bucket of water, and any that float, you know, they have a little hole in them from a native insect that turned it into its home. So those won't germinate. But all the ones that stay, you can then put in a Ziploc bag and put in the refrigerator, and either wait till you built your heavy duty wire cage, or you can even sow them in late March too. But if you've kept them in the refrigerator over the winter, that will count as a winter. But if you do that, you've got to start checking them that Ziploc bag every week starting in early March, because they will start to germinate in the refrigerator. So when I show you the outdoor method, that's preferable. But all the nuts, you've got to be well prepared for rodents. And then lots of other trees like maples. This is striped maple, ash, elm. Some of these winged fruits, they all also can't dry out. You really need to sow them right away. You don't need, like with maples, you can just collect the keys. You don't need to pull the embryo out or anything. You can just sow them. I like to sow them densely in a pot, cover them with sand, and some of them will germinate the next spring, like the different maples will. Silver maple and red maple, those seeds ripen in late May, early June. So you have to sow those right away then, and they'll actually germinate that summer. The striped maple and mountain maple and sugar maple, those seeds tend to ripen in September, early October, so they will germinate the next spring. So knowing to not let the seeds dry out is really key with a lot of the native species. Now, that said, we've got lots of species that are really easy to grow from seed. And here's just a few examples. So columbine on the upper left, those seeds tend to ripen about 6 weeks after they flower. They're little black shiny seeds. They can be stored dried, but they need a winter cold period to germinate. They just need about a month. Blue vervain, that's one that's blooming in late July. The seeds aren't ripe till late October, again, which is why not mowing an area, letting the seeds ripen is really important. Those need a couple months of winter before they'll germinate. All the different milkweeds, they all need a couple months of winter. And they also, those pods, that's probably the plant that most people have the best understanding of its value, just because the monarch butterfly has made them famous. But when those pods split, you can collect those seeds and store them dry and then sow them outdoors. Iris, those need about 3 months of winter before they'll germinate. The wild strawberry are very easy to collect if you can give up eating them. I just take those fruits and squish them on a piece of cardboard, and then you can fleck them off and store them in a paper bag and then sow them outdoors in the fall. They only need about 10 days to 2 weeks of cold before they will germinate. And then we've got some species that don't require a winter, like the asters and the black-eyed coneflower. However, when, like I've just collected a lot of aster seeds, those seeds need another month or two of after ripening for the embryo to mature, and then they will germinate. So Wild Seed Project mission has been getting people to do this low-tech outdoor seed propagation. You need to think like a plant midwife. Where are these plants from? Why are we trying to grow them in the greenhouse when that's not what those seeds need actually to germinate? And so we have usually about 80 to 90 different species on the website. Most of them are the more easy ones to germinate. I saved the more tricky ones for classes that I teach. We do offer a few more stratified ones, but they're a lot of work. In a little bit, I'll talk more about our seeds, but now I'm going to walk you through the process how I like people to do it. So the best time to sow the seeds is sort of starting around now. Especially with this weird warm weather. Early November is risky to sow seeds now, because if you sowed any that didn't need a cold period, like the asters, they could germinate, with, I was in Rhode Island in mid-November and it was 75 degrees. So really December and early January are the ideal times to do your native seed sowing. And you don't need to know, does this species need 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 months or 5 months? Bunchberry needs 5 months of winter cold period. All you need to know is late fall, early winter is the best time to sow the native seeds. So I like to have people sow them in pots. And this is, everybody wants to just toss the native seeds out on the landscape. It's very romantic. Oh, we just throw them out there and we'll have all these beautiful wildflowers popping up everywhere. Well, all of our soil has so many weed seeds in it, which will all grow much more quickly than our native plants. So I really like to get people to sow the seeds in pots. I think works even better than in a bed. You can make a prepared seed bed. I like to have people use good organic compost-based potting soil. You know, growing healthy, robust plants isn't just a matter of not using pesticides. It's also of having soil that is biologically alive. And so if you have some, you know, there are all these great potting soils now that are compost based, get some of them. And you can use, you don't want to use fiber pots because those are designed for vegetables and annual flowers, so they break down too quickly. You know, the native seeds grow slower than that. So you can use heavy duty plastic pots. You can use clay pots, actually work the best. They're just heavy. But so what I like to have people do is sow their seeds in the pot, and I have people take a whole package of our seeds and sow them in each pot. So on the left, the picture is black-eyed coneflower. On the middle is New England aster, and you do not need to remove the fluffy appendage of the seeds of asters to sow them. And then on the right is the milkweed. So, you know, you can see there's 50 to 100 seeds in those pots. You can sow them densely. I like to say native seeds are like teenagers. They all like to be crowded together. I swear they germinate better that way. You know, if I took these same seeds and spaced them out one at a time, they wouldn't be as happy. They really just seem to do well. And then you cover those seeds with coarse sand. And that coarse sand is really important because it helps keep the seeds from splashing out in the rain. The grittiness of it also helps keep, you know, you don't get fungal gnats and damping off all the problems that you have in a greenhouse. When you sow them and you cover them with sand and then put them outside, you just don't have those problems. You also tend to cover the seeds to the depth of the thickness of the seed. So if you're planting an acorn, that would be an inch deep. If you're planting a sunflower seed, it would be 1/4 of an inch deep. A sesame seed would be 1/8 of an inch deep. And then the tiny dust-like seeds, they are the ones that really you grow on the surface of soil. Then you push those labels down. You can do this inside. You can water them unless it's raining or snowing when you're doing it, in which case you can just carry them outside. You find a place in the shade, and this is also important, that's level and shady. You cover them with wire mesh. Again, otherwise the squirrel is going to go plant some acorns in it, or a cat's going to walk across it and dig a hole. But the shade is really important for before the seeds germinate, because come spring, you know, if you leave home every day and go to work, you know, if your seed flats dry out, you can kill a seedling. Once, you know, germination is a process, not a one-point event. It happens over a number of days. So if you have them in the shade, there's less swings of temperature and less likely that they'll dry out. When people fail with seed sowing, it's often that the seedlings had started to germinate and then they dried out. The other really nice thing that the sand does is sand tends to dry out before the potting soil, and because it's on the top, you'll see, you know, you can walk by your flats and you'll see they're kind of getting light in color and know it's time to water them, but be pretty assured that the potting soil hasn't dried out. Whereas if you've, you know, had your tomato plants on your windowsill or under the light and came home one day and the soil was already dry, you really damaged them. So sand has a lot of great uses. So then you just leave them all winter, that freeze and thaw. So rain, snow, sleet, you know, 0-degree temperatures, then 40 degrees the next day. These are wild plants and wild seeds that have a heavy seed coat. That freeze and thaw really helps break up that heavy seed coat, and the seeds get really well hydrated with that winter outside. And then what starts happening in the spring, starting in late March, and this is for me in Portland, Maine, so probably even sooner now. Portland, Maine's weather is like Massachusetts was, you know, 20 years ago. So you're probably like Connecticut now here, but this is early April, and you can see a lot of things have already started to germinate. And then by mid-May, you know, you will get a lot of germination. And so you can see this. So these are 4-inch square pots. So in 1 square foot, you can have 9 different species with hundreds of seedlings in each pot. Now, you could never have the seedlings that close together if you were in a greenhouse. They would be just rotting or falling apart. But outdoors, that cold, raw, wet weather, just the kind of weather that farmers hate, because all the crops that farmers are growing are from a tropical or Mediterranean climate for the most part. That raw spring weather is exactly what our native seedlings like. And so then what I like to have people do is take your pot of seedlings and just move it to a much bigger pot, as opposed to dividing them up right then and there. You can do that, but you set them back a couple weeks with the root disturbance. So, if you're looking for if you're a nursery, you're going to be potting them up. But if you're a homeowner or a community project, you instead just take that 4-inch pot, tip it out and put it in a gallon pot and give those seedlings just the space to grow over the summer. Some, like New England Astra, will grow this tall. Milkweed, same thing. You will have monarch butterflies appearing and laying eggs on your milkweed seedlings that first summer. And grow them on through the summer and wait and plant them out, divide them up and plant them out in the landscape in mid-September is a great time. Waiting till the heat of the summer is over. Now, again, if you're a nursery, you can pot them up and grow them on for sale the next year, but the fall is a really great time to get plants out in the landscape. Now, there are some plants that don't cooperate for, expectant propagators. So this is the wild geranium. And some years, only some of them will germinate the next spring. And so if you look at this picture, the bigger geranium-like leaves, those germinated the year before. So that for some reason that spring, there wasn't high germination, but I knew the rest of the seeds were in there and I knew that they were fine. And sure enough, they all germinated the next year. So the next year I decided I had an intern and I had her count out 200 wild geranium seeds because I wanted to record exactly what percentage I'm going to show her how only a third will germinate the next year. That next spring they all germinated. So like they don't always do what we expect, but they, even seeds that don't germinate that first year, that doesn't mean they're not good. They're just on a different time scale. And, our native plants have existed in Eastern North America for a long time, and they figured out what they need to survive in our varied climate. So these are jack-in-the-pulpit seedlings. That's about 30 seedlings in that little 4-inch pot. So the first year you just get this little 1-inch leaf. And so I will then take that whole pot and either move it into a bigger pot, or you could also put it in the ground with a label in it, let them grow on in the ground for another year or two, and then divide them up more. Again, lots of seedlings do really close together. This is silky dogwood. This is one of the fastest shrubs. If you need to put in a hedge really quickly, this is one of the native shrubs that you can produce really quickly. So there's like 50 seedlings in that 8-inch pot. So this picture is taken in early June. So we then moved that pot of seedling into like a 2-gallon pot. And then in September, divided those up. And if you prepared a site, like you could have spent the summer with cardboard and mulch preparing where your hedge was going to go. And then you can just go out in September, make a slice with your shovel and put those plants in the ground. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Wild Seed Project seeds and what it takes to get them. So I have a core team of about 12 volunteers who help us with all our seed collecting. So, a couple of them were retired ecologists, so I didn't have to do a lot of training. Although not all botanists and ecologists know about seeds, but they know a lot about plants. But just some people I'm able to teach all the species. I start with the easier ones, but I have a core of about 12 people who are our key seed core. And so, I teach them about how to judge ripeness and getting them to help us collect the seeds. About 2/3 of the seeds on our website are all, directly from the wild. The other third are either plants that aren't common enough in the wild. So we get them from our native stock beds, but it's a lot of fun to collect the seeds. This is Joe Pie weed, this year's harvest. And that's, I don't know, 100,000, a big bowl of 100,000 seeds. You sow those seeds in the methods I just showed you. Almost all of those seeds will germinate and become plant. Each one of those seeds is the result of sexual reproduction. It's all going to be a unique individual, and some of those individuals are going to like what's coming from our climate. So, when you sow them in a controlled environment, you can have really good germination and produce a lot of plants. Now, all the cleaning and packaging of the seeds is a lot of work, but it's a ton of fun. And we get people asking us a lot, oh, do you need to get lots of machines for cleaning the seeds? I'm like, no, I have people begging to come help clean the seeds. This is a really fun job. And you actually do a better job if you do it by hand. Machines, don't, have the intelligence that we do and can't judge, and you waste a lot of seeds. So we spend all fall cleaning the seeds and have a lot of fun doing it. Now, Wild Seed Project, we about 6 months ago just signed a partnership with the Cape Elizabeth Land Trust right near Portland, and we are setting up our native seed center there. All of the seed operation has been in my backyard and a couple of my key seed volunteers' backyards. So, trying to set something up for the future. So I'd always had this thing, we don't need our own land. Lots of land trusts have land they don't know what to do with. So we are very excited about this. And so we're just in the process of getting this started now. The greenhouse is not to grow the plants, that's workspace. So that's where we will clean and process and do the fall, the seed sowing in a couple weeks in there. We'll have a fenced area, and then we're gonna have a lot of founders plots with the different species, especially, there's more and more demand. People want to know the known provenance of what the seed is. And just with the increased demand, and every year, I do see even common species populations dwindling. So the chance to have these, masses of different, the different species, and it'll also be a great demonstration for people to be able to come and see the propagation and just to see the plants. It will be very beautiful. I mean, when I was at Garden in the Woods, the nursery was set up there, and that was always a favorite part of the tour group, people getting to see how the plants are grown. So we're very excited to make this happen. Now, I have tremendous faith in a seed, and even in a year like this was not an abundant seed year. Multiple droughts, and then it was really hot and dry, and then in Maine we had some weird rain, but I'd say this has been one of the lowest seed years for many species I've seen in a number of years. But still, I've collected a lot of seeds, and I know when I sow those seeds, even just a tiny little pinch of seeds, that will produce 50 or 100 plants. And some of those are going to be the perfect individual to, take this new climate that's roaring at us really quickly. So thank you. I'm happy to go through and answer some questions.
Thank you, Heather. That was terrific. And we're happy to take questions both from our live audience here in Cambridge and also from those of you participating via. So first, let me turn to folks in our audience here in Cambridge. Does anyone have a question for Heather?
I do. Hi, Heather. That was great. To just respond to the very last thing you said about our changing climate. I understand that Wild Seed Project occasionally has seeds of species that you're not going to run into the wild in Maine very often. They might be species from further south, but I guess in keeping with your comment, these are species that might be able to handle the changing climate that's going to rise in Maine.
So you're asking, what do I think about growing plants from farther south than this? So yes, so I've studied a lot of paleobotany and past climates, and what do plants and animals do when the climate change? What have they done forever? It's moved back and forth. So I absolutely think, I mean, I can see the difference in the climate in Maine just in the 25, 30 years that I've been there. It's very noticeable. So, I wouldn't choose, more aggressive, I'm not going to go seek out aggressive species from down south, but yes, I am not afraid. I mean, when I was at Garden in the Woods, we actually grew a lot of species from farther south, and it was amazing how many were hardy back then, even this far north. So yes, I think we are in a crisis situation, and we have set up a lot of obstacles to plants and animals moving on their own. We've got people and development everywhere, and at least in our yards is perfectly, I'm willing to do it. I know that I lived in California for a number of years, and I find out west they're much more progressive on the topic of assisted migration than people in New England. So I guess I fall in that camp.
Thanks, Heather. Let's take the question from the Zoom line.
So there are a few comments first. A few from Melissa Spearing, and I don't know if you have anything to say about her comments, but I wanted to read them up. She has managed to get Trillium grandiflora to bloom for seed after 5 years, 6 for red Trillium with rich rotten mixed salt and hardwood sawdust at the sowing run. So there's the Trillium, and then she says Acer, except silver maple, elm, and ash species are all orthodox in seed storage behavior, so they can be dried, but might become dormant. So you had mentioned Acer is one.
But if you sow them right away, they will germinate the next spring. As far as the Trillium goes, yeah, I mean, you can speed things up with extra rich soil, but we also are trying to grow plants that can tough it out in the world. So, that's great for gardens, but not necessarily if we, is it in the best interest of the plants? I don't know. I mean, we can play God in our nursery, so.
So Dana Beach asks, are there species that absolutely need to freeze thaw as opposed to just putting them in the fridge?
Yes, it's why I think you typically have better germination when you put them outside because of the freeze and thaw. The 40-degree temperature of your refrigerator, you don't get those swings that make them swell and then contract and break up the heavy seed coat. So, some species, the refrigerator works fine, but why are we using fossil fuels to chill our seeds when you can do it outside? I guess that's my question. Just like, why are we forcing them in a let's save our greenhouse for growing our food crops, which are mostly tropical or Mediterranean. So I do think absolutely the freeze and thaw is better. Just like I showed you, the New England aster, for instance, does not have to, you can sow those in the spring too. And every year I sow some now, and then I sow some more in late March. And the ones that I sow in the fall and go through the whole winter, those are some of the first seeds to germinate in early April. The ones that I sow in March or, late March or early April, they take a lot longer to germinate. So I do think the outdoor stratification is superior. There is one new problem that I am having, and that is the torrential rains we're having, especially with the small, dusty seeds. And I've been experimenting with different things. Now I tend to group all those together. This year, I'm going to keep a storm window handy, and when I hear some torrential storms coming, I might just throw it over that batch just during the storm and then take it off again. A lot of people have great success growing seedlings in a milk jug. And I've done that. I can't say that I love it. So I think I'm going to go with the storm window idea, but I am seeing more small seeds splashing out. And since I know what the seedlings look like, I can find them and collect them, but they are jumping around more. So that torrential rain. And likewise, if you were doing a, seed, so, let's say you just sowed a meadow or a landscape sowing, think of all the seeds that are getting washed away. Russ, I thought of one more thing for Russ's comment, which is while I am all for some assisted migration, that doesn't mean that we in every region we live in should be helping to get more of our local genotype too. Of course, that's what we can do locally.
So if you could repeat the question, this microphone's not working anymore. So,
Okay.
and they can't hear you. Or they can't hear me. So the next one is, are there any common issues to watch out for while the seedlings are still in pots for spring, summer?
Common things to watch out for: drying out. So so her question was, what are you looking for once they've germinated as you're growing them on through the late spring, summer, and fall? So when they start to look crowded in the pot, or they're drying out quickly, that's when you tip it out and put it in a much bigger pot. And some species grow quicker than others. So, you can always keep moving the pots up if you find it's quickly filling up the space. So if it's a sun-loving species, once they do germinate, then you do want to move those seedlings into the sun. The shade-loving species can just stay in the shade all summer, and that's very low maintenance. Something in the sun going to dry out a lot more, and you'll have to water it a lot more. If you've used a good organic potting soil, I don't usually find you need to do anything else, but if for some reason you thought they looked a little peaked, I like the liquid seaweed as a good fertilizer for it, but you're not trying to pump them up. Remember, we're trying to let them grow at a moderate pace so that they'll have good longevity, not be pushed too much.
And how long will seeds keep dry?
Dry storage, you mean? Well, yeah, okay. How long does it varies from species to species, but in general, native seeds that can be dry stored, if you store them in we store all ours in a glass jar in the refrigerator, they can many seeds can last several, 5 years, 10 longer. Another great area for research. I think the seeds last longer, probably longer if they're damp, buried in soil, would be my guess. Because that's, what would happen in nature. They'd get buried and then a hurricane would come through and suddenly all these things would germinate. But in a jar in the refrigerator, they can in fact, blue-eyed grass. Last year I had all this 5-year-old blue-eyed grass seed, and so I sowed all of it, and I sowed it really densely, way more than what I just showed you, figuring half of them won't germinate. They all germinate. I think they germinated better than first year seed. So our native seeds are amazing. They really are, and you can't judge them the way you can with our domesticated seeds. Like if your lettuce seeds don't germinate in a week or 10 days, they're probably dead. But that's just not true of our native seeds unless you cooked them or mishandled them. But
We have two more questions on here. So, any info, luck, or experience on germination of triostem species?
no luck or no experience with that. Any luck with triostem species? No, not me anyways.
What seed research do you think needs to be done to help address native plant shortages in trade?
There's endless things that could be studied. I just think we need to get out and do it more. And lots of, individuals and community groups doing this, that's how we're going to get a lot of plants out in the landscape quickly. The nursery world is very industrial now, and most people aren't seed propagators, so I don't see that where the big change is going to happen. Just like in the organic farming movement, when it wasn't big chemical ag who started suddenly going organic, it was new upstarts doing it. And that's where I think that a lot where it will happen with the native plants is more smaller native nurseries. And that's how we'll keep the genetic diversity and not the mass production. And because the nursery trade is really focused on clones and cultivars, and those don't make a resilient landscape. They might look pretty to some of us, but they're not going to help us, our future landscape, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Any experience with propagating aquatic plants? If they're thinking of Sly Farm in Arlington, which is now only invasive.
You mean he's asking if they're experienced with propagating aquatic plants. Well, like pickerel weed, it's not hard to germinate those seeds, or arrowhead, iris, Joe Pye weed, lots of wetland plants. Is that
I was
aquatic?
thinking more of plants in the water that never.
Water lily, that one, that's one, I think it's designed to be eaten by a snapping turtle or something. So you've got to bite a hole in it or something to get it to germinate. So it's really thinking like what happens to that seed in nature and figuring out how to mimic it. Probably lots of aquatic plants aren't that hard to grow. Although they do tend to have fresh seed, not dried seed.
That's why I was about to ask a very similar question. So I've heard a lot about scarification.
Yeah.
Seeds, usually like berries. And I'm wondering if that's something that's prevalent here. I've never really heard it talked about here. I've heard like botanists out west talk about things passing them by their gut. So I'm wondering if there's any specific one.
Sometimes, well, yes, lots, you think of all these fruits. Oh, he's asking about scarification of the seeds. So typically, like take our native sundial lupin. If you plant that outdoors, the freeze and thaw will break the heavy seed coat. You can file a hole in it, file it and then plant it out in the spring. Bayberry is one that we do take those seeds, and you got to get the wax off. That prevents it. So I do that on either sandpaper or a rough screen. Most of the fruits, are obviously designed to go through the belly of a bird, but I find the fermentation does it enough. Sometimes sand, rubbing sand in with a Ziploc bag where you're squishing it can help. But I find in most cases, won't say all, the freeze and thaw will do it.
Well, why don't we just take one more?
Can you talk a little bit about what happened in that second year when you taken your steps out of the how many do you tend to put that up into? I mean, just bury the whole pump.
So but it was the jack in the pulpit, because they're slow. They're going to be 3, 4, 5 years before they'll probably bloom. I would take that and plant it in the slow growing woodland ones. Planting them in the shade in the real ground is a great thing to do with them, because it's very low maintenance and they will grow well. If it's milkweed, for instance, let's say you were trying to diversify your meadow, you could have germinated the milkweed or aster seeds or penstemon seeds and grown them through the summer, and then you took that gallon pot of foot or foot and a half seedlings, then you can just divide those up and plant them out in the meadow individually. If you were planting you want a New England aster in your garden, I like to plant them as a clump. Just like when I would pot them up for sale, I typically, with a lot of the native perennials, I like to put 3, 5, 7 in a pot together. That way, when somebody buys it and puts it in their garden, it both makes a nice bushy plant, and they will have, you know, sex going on because they'll have multiple individuals there.
Thank you. I was wondering what your experience with growing pea family plants from seed, like especially thinking about what your thoughts might be on using inoculant.
Native legumes and whether you use inoculant. I don't tend to do it. I suppose if I was planting them in Somerville in a very sterile soil, I might consider doing it. But otherwise, good compost-based potting soil, and then out in real life, I never use inoculant myself. Yes, and they grow.
Well, I just want to give a huge thank you to Heather for coming down to Cambridge to be with us, to speak to us about the wonderful work of the Wild Seed Project. And I would also like to thank all of you who came out on a very blustery day here in New England to attend the lecture tonight. And just finally to thank our entire Zoom audience for being with us tonight. And I hope everyone will consider joining us for our upcoming meetings or in membership. And one last thank you and round of applause for Heather McCargo and the incredible work of the Wild Seed Project.